Hey, what is up? My name is Chris and welcome to Coding in Public. Today we're working on a coffee brew recipes app where you can store custom recipes for different coffee you might make at home. Now, you may not be into coffee. I am, so even if you don't like coffee, I think you can learn a lot about JavaScript, and that's why you should be here anyhow, I think. So what you would do is come in here and say something like morning brew, and you can add your method, so like a V60, and you can say what roast you would want, like a full city, and a grind size on your grinder, and set the ratio of 1 parts coffee to 16 parts water. You can add an optional note here, like works best with fruity coffee, I don't know, something like that. All right, and then you hit enter to add the recipe, and all those details show up here with the name up top. You can refresh and it'll stay there because we're going to save it to local storage. And then you can delete the recipe if you want, and it will be gone. We're going to do some cool stuff with this. I've done these kinds of videos before with little apps like this, but we're going to use some more modern array methods to find and locate certain things. We're going to write our own custom event, and we're going to use that event to trigger the UI and saving to the local storage. And we're going to use Dom Purify to make sure we remove any malicious code that somebody might add to your app. So there's several things we're going to do that are a little different than what I've done in the past. So I hope even if you've watched some of these videos in the past, that this will be kind of a step up for you. And we're going to do this all in one video, all the HTML, all the CSS, and all the JavaScript. And that's because we're going to use Bootstrap, which is a framework for CSS where we can basically write classes in the HTML and the markup, and that will style it according to Bootstrap styling using their own classes. And so I'll show you how to do that as well. Source code will be in the description. I'll probably throw this up somewhere online too, so you can check that out and kind of play with it live if you get stuck. And that's enough. Let's jump in. Okay, I told you we were starting blank, and that's the truth. I've got 2 blank files, index.html and app.js, and that's all we got. So if I come over here, the first thing I'm going to do is open this up in Chrome, which has exactly nothing in it. So let's go ahead and add some boilerplate here, and I'll say like coffee recipe app. All right, something like that. And right now we won't have anything to body. Well, I guess let's add an H1 of like hi. We save, okay, and it hot reloads. Now I mentioned we were going to use Bootstrap. So let's use Bootstrap 5. And if I jump in here and let's see, get started, we're just going to use the CDN link here. So we're just linking to the style sheet that Bootstrap 5 has, and I'll add that up top here. And now when I save this, let me move over here first. I save this, it's going to use Bootstrap's text, their styling and all that already automatically because we've tied into their CSS style sheet. Okay, so next thing we need to do is let's go ahead and add our app script src, and we're going to add app.js, and that's just to make sure that we don't forget, and I'll add it here in the head, so I need to add defer so it loads after the body. If I come in here and open this up, and then let's jump over here to our app.js and say like console log hi, and it's working. Okay, cool. So that's as beginner as we get in the sense that I'm starting from absolute scratch. We'll add something else here in the head in a little bit, but right now let's not worry about it. Let's just go ahead and start working out how to type out this markup. If I come over to Bootstrap, you'll notice the way it works if you haven't used something like this is like if I want to add margin to something, I would just come in here and they're going to tell me which classes I need to use to have the margin work the way I'm expecting. So M means margin, and then I can say MT for top, and then set a size from 0 all the way to whatever. And they have examples of how you'd use this. So MS1 means margin left with spacer times 0.25. So here they're showing you kind of what it does. And if you have questions about how to use Bootstrap, let me know. I'm happy to do a video on it. I don't really use it that much because I prefer to write my own CSS, mostly so I can remember it. But it's certainly a very popular framework, and it will help us today to speed stuff up. All right, so let's jump over here, and we're going to do a few things. First of all, we're going to add a container up top, and this is just a div with the class of container. And then we're going to have a div with the class of row and with margin 4 all the way around. And our H1 will have a class of text primary, which will change it to Bootstrap's blue color, and display 4, which is the size of the text. And we'll say coffee brew recipes. And I think we need a text center up here, which is another class that will make everything inside this row text center. Finally, for this top section, we're going to have a font size of small, or a 5, I think is what that stands for. And then text muted will be another class we add as well, not mute, but muted, which will again work on the color. And we'll say add custom recipes for your home brews below, period. All right, and if I save, it shows up here, and this is using all the Bootstrap's kind of normal styling here as well. Now, let's see, I'm going to add one more thing here. Let's do font weight normal. That will make the font weight normal for the font that Bootstrap uses. Okay, everything else will be kind of our main area, so we're going to add main. This is good for accessibility and just good practice in general. And in here, we're going to have a container, and that container will hold a form. The form will have an ID, let's see, not a div with a class of form, but an actual form with an ID of recipe form. And then we'll have some classes on that. Let's see, padding 4 all the way around. We'll do a margin 4 all the way around. It will have row, shadow, small to add a small shadow, rounded 3, which is the size of the rounding. It'll have a border, and it will have that color of the border will be border primary. Okay, we're not going to have an action on this form. We're going to actually prevent it by default anyhow when we get to the JavaScript. So let's just remove it now. Okay, so inside this form, we're going to have several divs that are all going to have the class of form group. They'll all have the class of column medium 4, and then my, which is up and down margin of 2. Now this column medium 4 means when the screen gets to the medium size, as Bootstrap defines that, it'll switch to where there'll be 3 even columns. And the reason it says medium 4 is because Bootstrap works off a 12 column system, so 4 columns would be a third of 12. Inside here, we're going to have on each of these a label, and this label this one will be for name, and we're going to say name of, let's see, recipe, something like that. And then below here, we'll have an input, and not an impu, an input. And it will be a type of text, but we're going to add several other things to this. First of all, we're going to have required on here, and if I hit enter here and I come over here and start to type, sometimes you'll get like a drop down of random stuff here, and I don't really like that, especially on something like this. So I'll just say auto complete, and we're going to set that to off. And then we will need an idea on here of name that will match the 4 and the label that will link those two, which is good for accessibility and also just tells the form kind of what's linked to what. And then I'll add a class of form control on here, and we will go ahead and add a placeholder text to tell people kind of the kinds of things they should be saying here. So morning brew might be a good thing. That way they know how that works. And as soon as I save, you see everything kind of works as Bootstrap has it naturally laid out for you. All right, we're going to just copy this down. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. And now we'll just change out the text of each of these. So after our name, we have a method, so our brew method, and we'll change this to say brew method. And then we'll have a V60, which is a kind of coffee brewer, pour over as the example. And I'm just going to change each of these so that they reflect the different settings. But I'm just going to change the form, or the for, the ID, the name, and then whatever the example is. So you don't need to watch me do that. Let me do that, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, I'm back with you now, and let's see, let me remove this placeholder on the notes. This one's going to be optional, so I added that there. I'm going to remove the required attribute so the form can submit even if they don't have anything in that notes field. I'll go ahead and save, and this should all populate over this way just like we need it to. Let me get rid of this. We can pull that up later. All right, so we've got the basic form laid out. We need one more thing, which is a button to submit. We'll add a div with the class form group like the other ones. It'll also have MT for top of 4. And then inside this div, I will have an input. And this input will have a type not of text, but of submit, which will make it that button. And that will submit the form. I'm going to set a value of this to add a recipe. And that will be the text of the button itself. And then add classes here, Bootstrap again, of BTN for the button, and then BTN primary for the color of the button, and save that, and that should pop right in. All right, so we've got our form done. We need to add 2 more divs inside this container div. The first one, we're going to add a class of container again, And inside here, we're going to add a row with a class of M4, which is margin 4 all the way around. It will have a border of bottom, and that border will be the size of 3, and it will be the color of primary. And then I'll expand that here. And inside here, we'll have a paragraph with a class of H3 to make it the size of heading 3, text primary to make it that color, and it will say saved recipes. I'll save that and it should show up below. There we go. So we've got that container, and lastly, we need somewhere to put all the recipes. So we're going to add another div, and let's see, let me pop this in the same container. This one will be a row. It'll say row columns 1. This will be the default. And then row calls medium 3. So at 3 columns, or when it gets to the medium size, it'll take up a fourth of the screen. And then we'll have a margin left and right of 4 and a margin up and down of 6. Those are the sizes, and then text of center. And then we will add an ID of recipe container. All right, if you don't understand what I'm doing here, this is just Emmet, which comes standard in most browser or most code editors, or you can enable it usually, and adding all of those classes at once, and then I just hit the little expansion thing, and it pops all those out just as you want. So that's what I'm doing to make it a little quicker for you. Okay, so we've got everything we need here. We're going to now just jump over to the JavaScript. All right, and isn't that crazy that we already finished all the HTML and the CSS? All right, so in here we're going to do several things. First of all, we need query selectors. So these are things that we need globally, selectors. And then we're going to have functions. And then we're going to have event listeners. So query selectors, we just need a few things here. We'll need the recipe form, I think is the ID we gave that, which we'll set to document.querySelector. And that was called, it was a ID of recipe form. And we'll copy this down. The next thing we need is our recipe container, and that will be equal to recipe container. This is where all the recipes will live, down below that saved recipes section. And then finally, we need a let variable, because we're going to be updating this to list items. We're going to set that to an empty array for now. That's where we're going to store everything, and we're going to use that variable to populate the UI and the local storage. So what do we want to do? Well, when somebody starts to enter in things for each of these and they hit add recipe, we want to be able to grab everything, all the values of those form inputs. So let's go ahead and do an event listener on the recipe form. So we'll do add event listener. We're listening for submit. You'll want to do click on the button or something like that, because submit will catch that click on the button and hitting enter to enter the form. And so it's best just to use the submit if you have a form. And whenever somebody submits, we want to run a function called handle form submit. All right. And we're actually not going to manually run it. We're going to tell the browser to run it for us. Function handle form submit. And we do need an event. And let's go ahead and console log the event. All right. So here's what's going to happen when somebody comes in here and they add in stuff. Let's see. Let's just add all the required fields. And then I hit add recipe. Let's pull up the console and then hit add recipe. Nothing happens. What in the world? Well, the reason nothing's happening is because when you submit a form, by default, it actually refreshes your page. So the first thing we need to do is say e.prevent default, which is an event or method that lives on that event. Now we can come in here and say stuff, and then hit submit. And now we get the submit event. So inside here, we've got a bunch of things, but you'll notice that inside of the form itself, we have all of these inputs. So we've got the name, we've got the size, all that kind of stuff. So what we want to do now is go ahead and grab all of those. So const name is equal to, rather than document.querySelector, let's do recipe form.querySelector. So we're not looking at the whole document, we're just looking at the form. So let's just limit ourselves to that, make it do less work. We're looking for the name here, and we're looking for the dot value of the name. So let's copy this down, let's see, 6 times. And now I'm going to select the first one, hit Command D to select them both, and change this to method. And the next one we had was roast, and then grind, and then ratio, and finally note. All right, so we've got all 6 of those input fields. And then what we want to do is use those to populate a new object. So we're going to call that new recipe, something like that. And we're going to set that to this object. And what we would do is say name is equal to name. Now, if we do that works, and I can hit save, and that should work fine. But when they're both the key and the value are the same, you can actually just do one thing like that. Name, method, roast, grind, ratio, and note. And that will capture each of those in a key value pair, where the key is name, method, roast, grind, ratio, and note, and the value is the variable we grabbed up here, whatever the value is that the user inputted. Now we're going to add one more thing that's not part of the UI, and that will be an ID, and we're going to set that to date.now. Now, this will give you milliseconds from like epoch, which I think is January 1st, 1970, in milliseconds, which most of the time, if you're not dealing with like a bunch of people hitting a database or something, we're just saving this to local storage, so it doesn't matter. But if this is like an open app on the web and somebody's submitting something at the exact same millisecond, which is possible, you could actually have 2 things with the same ID. But for our purposes, this should work just fine. And I actually don't need a semicolon there. I can add an extra comma just in case we add something else so I don't forget or need to add it later manually. Okay, so if I come down here now and I hit console log new recipe, and then let's go ahead, jump over to our console, and we're going to add a bunch of random stuff. So I'll add stuff here, and stuff here, and hit enter, and I get this object that has my grind, my ID, my method, my name, my note, my ratio, and my roast. You might wonder why they're out of order. Objects don't worry about the order the things are in, and so that's why it happens to rearrange it as it likes, alphabetically. What we want to do then is take our list items, and we want to push our new recipe onto that. So we're going to say basically take this empty array, and I want you to push this new thing into that array. So I could do the same thing, and if I console logged list items, it would show what we just looked at a moment ago. Now you might say, okay, well, when somebody hits new recipe, I want it to actually refresh all of these, clear them out, each of them. So we could go to each of these and say name is equal to nothing, method is equal to nothing, and just do empty strings for all of those. Or to reset all of them, we can say e.target, which is the form itself, .reset, and that should reset them all for us. So we've gathered everything, we've added it to our array. Now what we need to do is actually populate the UI. So we want to actually display the recipes. So for now, let's go ahead and say display recipes, and we'll call that from our handle form submit function. Function display recipes, and we can write it down here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating a temporary string. So we'll say const temp string is equal to, and then we're going to take our list items, which is that array that we pushed our object into, and we're going to use an array method called map. And what this will allow us to do is to take an item, whatever the first thing is that we're looping through, so each thing we're looping through, and let's add backticks here, and what we can do is just basically interpolate each item in the array into this map. So what we're going to do now is actually write some HTML and using classes, CSS, directly in here. So I kind of lied when I said we were done with those, because now we need to actually write the HTML and CSS that will populate our UI. And again, we're going to use Bootstrap classes, and we'll start with a class of column. And then inside this div, we'll have another div that has a class of card. Let's see, not class, but card. And then MB for margin bottom 4, rounded 3 for the size of the rounding, a shadow of small, and a border of primary. And then I'll populate that. And the way that Bootstrap works, you have a card, and inside the card you have 2 items. You can have a card header, which is what we're going to have to start with, header, and that will have padding up and down of 3, and then it'll have text white and border, or no, let's see, background of primary, and we will have a border of primary as well. Now inside here, this is the top, that blue section of the recipe container itself. We will add an H4 with a class of 0 margin up and down. that will ensure that the default styling for H4 doesn't mess up the padding, kind of the margin in that top card header section. And because we used backticks here, not only can we do multiple lines, but we can also say we want the item that was passed in .name to populate the H4. So if that's the H4, that blue top section, so if I came over here, oh, I don't have it anymore, but let's quickly add this. We add stuff here. That's this section right here, this blue section. So everything else is going to live here, and then we're going to have a delete button as well. So let's build that out now. So we have the card header, and then we have the card body. This is how Bootstrap, again, builds this out. Inside here, we're going to have a UL with the class of text start, which will counter the text center that was on the whole section here. But I could have done that, I guess, different ways, but that's how I did it. And then we'll come in here, and we're going to have just list items here. So li, and then inside here, we're going to have a strong tag. And this strong tag, if I can get this to work here, this first one will just say method, and then colon, and we'll do a space and finish the strong tag. And then in here, as you might have guessed, we'll do item.method. And that will pull in the method that the person entered. And we're going to copy each of these down, and I won't make you watch, but I'll add the roast, the grind size, the ratio, and the note. All right, so I added each of those. Now, we've got a trouble spot because if the person doesn't add a note, we actually don't want note to show there because it'll just say note with nothing there. So we can actually, because we've got backticks, we can just do a ternary here. So let's say something like if item, I guess I need a $sign on the front of that. If item.note.length has nothing, so that's what that bang means. If there is no length to it, then we will say just give us an empty string. Otherwise, then go ahead and give us this. And let's wrap this again in backticks. And let's close that out, and that should work for us perfectly. Now we have one more thing, which is to add that button that will be on each of these recipe cards. So let's see, inside this same div. So right here, we're going to have a button with a class of btn and btn large, which is again a Bootstrap way of saying what size you want the button to be. And then we'll have a btn outline danger, which is that red color. Now we need to add a couple other things. We've got a class on this button, but we're going to actually set a value of the button to our ID or item.id, which means that that button will actually contain a number to identify it when we click on it. That'll help us later when we add an event listener on our buttons. Now, for accessibility reasons, it probably would also be good to add an ARIA label here. What we'll do is set this to say delete, and then we'll add a string here, and we'll just say item.name. All right. What that is doing is rather than when somebody uses a screen reader, rather than just saying button or something like that, it'll say delete, morning brew recipe or whatever. And so that way they'll know what they're doing when they click on the button. Okay, so we've written a bunch of HTML in here. Now we can come down here and just do .join. So after it goes through each item in our array, we'll just say, hey, join this all and add no spaces between it. So it's just going to be a long string of HTML. So if I came down here and said console log and did temp string, there we go. Let's come over here now and add a bunch of stuff and then hit enter, and you'll notice it loops through it. In this case, we only have one item and it just adds it as one massive string. It's not yet HTML, it's just a string. So what we need to do finally is to take our recipe container and say .inner HTML, and we need to set this to our temp string. Now let's do this one more time, and let me remove this so we can see it live. Come in here, we add a bunch of stuff, and now all that HTML is added for us. And if we add another one, these are the worst names ever, but I'm just trying to go quick for your sake. We add another one, now it's just gonna stack because it's on mobile, but if I can get this to move for me, here we go. You'll see them start to stack out. Now we've got a problem. That's not working. Let's try again. Oh, I think it's because I refreshed the page. Let's do another one here. See what this does. Okay, it's not working. We're having a problem. We will figure that out. Console, nothing's wrong in the console. So I'm not totally sure what I've done yet, but we've got another problem that we're going to run into in a moment here. Now, people can come in here because we're asking them to input and we're using inner HTML. We're actually allowing the user to put HTML onto our page, which means they could say something like image, src equals like google.com/ I don't know, something.img, and then say on error, show an alert that says hacked. And then if they add in the rest of these things and hit enter, notice they can actually basically run JavaScript on your page. And because it had an error finding the image, now it throws up this error. And so that's called cross-site scripting. You can do much more dangerous things with that, but we actually want to make sure that the user can't do something like that. So whenever you take in input from a user, you want to make sure you purify it so that it doesn't contain any malicious code. And there's several ways you can do that. What we're going to do is use something, let's go over here, called Dom Purify. All right, this is just, let me grab this link here. So Dom Purify, it's just a script that basically, a JavaScript file that will take whatever you input and strip out any malicious code. And if we did like Dom Purify npm, you can see that there's an npm thing. We could install it that way. We could manually grab all the code from the GitHub. They show you a bunch of ways to use it, how to use it, where you can add it. We're just going to grab it from the CDN, jump back up to our index.html page. We'll add this in up here, and I guess we need a script. And then our source will be that link we just grabbed. And now if we run over here to our app.js, what we can do is for each of these, the name, the recipe, all this kind of stuff, let's jump down here, and I'm just going to grab each of these. Now, as you see over here on the right, they say if you just set whatever variables you want to Dom Purify .sanitize, and then in here in parentheses, you can actually wrap whatever you're wanting to purify. So I'll come in here and wrap that. Now, if I come over here and try to do the same thing, we'll add our hacked thing, add in all this stuff, hit enter. Okay, there we go. Now it's not entering it in, and you'll notice that it's trying to add an image, but there's no image, but at least I'm not allowing somebody to run JavaScript on my page. Okay, so that's how you use Dom Purify, and we're just, again, using it from the CDN, but it's pretty easy to make sure that somebody doesn't include malicious code on your site. Now, I want to talk a little bit about writing your own custom events. Right now, the way we're doing this is we're taking in some input from the user, we're handling that form submit input, and then we're asking this to run another function called display recipes. Now that's great, but this couples those a little too closely. So the better thing to do would be actually to create your own custom event. And we can do that with something called dispatch event. So we're going to grab our recipe container. That's what we're going to run it on. You can run these new events on whatever you want. So we'll say dispatch event. And what we want to dispatch is a new custom event. And we're going to call it whatever we want, but we'll just say refresh recipes. Refresh. There we go. Recipes. All right. And then I'll go ahead and save this. And then we can run an event handler for that. So we can come in here and say recipe container dot add event listener. This time we're listening for the, what do we call that? Let's just grab it up here. The refresh recipes event. So whenever that thing gets dispatched, then we want to run display recipes. And again, we're going to make the browser run it for us rather than us run it ourselves. So let's come in here. We're going to add just that one thing. It adds it below. Again, another thing. And we're getting some kind of error. This is the error we got before. We never worried about it. Eventually, we're going to have to start worrying about this. So let's see. We've got So the problem seems to be with our button itself. And as I look at this, it looks like we've got here these double quotation marks here. We've got a single and a double. That might fix some of our problem. And then we don't actually have any text. I don't know what we were thinking there. So delete recipe. Okay, well, let's try this again. So come over here. You can add a random name, add another random name, and let's see, moment of truth. Okay, they're both showing up. So I think it was just those quotation marks throwing everything off. Okay, cool. So now we are displaying everything we want, and we're using our custom our custom event that we created to dispatch that. So we've got everything displaying as we want it to, but the next thing we need to do is to save it to our local storage. So let's come in here. We're going to write another function. We're going to call this, let's see, mirror state to local storage. And then here, all we're going to do is we're going to check our local storage, which again is just in the user's actual browser itself, set item, and we're going to say we want to set this key, which we're going to create recipe container.list to list items. Now I'm going to save this, and then let's go ahead and open up our application storage, which in Chrome is under application and local storage here. And then we want to use this same thing here. Whenever we have this event triggered, we want to now also run mirror state to local storage. And again, we're going to just ask the browser to do that. So if I save it and I come over here and hit something, that should dispatch an event. Notice we get the key, but the value is just object to object, which is not helpful at all. And that's because it's actually just it's an object here. What we need, local storage only takes strings. So the best way to do that is to say json.stringify and then wrap that list items as the thing that it is going to stringify. And if I save this again and I come over here, I'm getting an error. That's because I spelled stringify incorrectly. Stringify, there we go. Okay, one more time, come in here, and something happened. Let's see if it's what we want. All right, there we go. Cool. So now it's actually showing us, hey, you've got this thing. It's got no other features to it, but you do have an ID and a name, which is what we want. Okay, so now it's saved into our local storage. Now what we can do is use the local storage to load on the window, say first check that, and go ahead and populate our UI. So let's come down here, and we're going to now say window.add event listener. And the event listener we're listening for is DOM content loaded. And when that happens, we're going to actually just write the function right in here rather than doing a callback. Well, now let's do a callback. So we'll call this like initial UI load. I don't know. Load initial UI. Does that work? Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and write this function up here. So we'll say function load initial UI. We're not going to take in anything. Now the first thing we're going to do is create a temporary variable. So we'll say temp local storage, and we're going to set that to, let's just grab this right here, and we'll say local storage.get item, and we're going to get what we just copied, the recipe list. We actually don't need all of this. We just need the list itself. So when somebody first uses the application, they actually won't have anything in this local storage. So we're going to run a check to see basically if it's their first time or if not. Because if it is their first time, we don't want to try to populate the UI with nothing. So we can come in here and say if temp local storage is equal to null, or if temp local storage is equal to an empty array. So maybe they cleared out everything, they've already been here before. Then we just want to return and get out of this function. Otherwise, so this is people who already have something in there that's not an empty array. We're going to say we want our temporary temp recipes, say something like that, to equal json.parse. So this is taking that string and trying to convert it back into an object that we can pass to our display function that we wrote up above. We're going to say parse temp local storage. All right, so if there is something in it, go ahead and parse it, turn it back into an array that we can use, an object that we can use. And then we're going to take whatever that is and say we want our list items dot push, and we can do this a bunch of different ways, but let's just spread in that array. So we're going to say temp recipes, and save that. So what it's doing is it's saying, hey, is there anything in your local storage? If not, then just jump out of it. If there is, go ahead and try to parse that, and then let's push that onto our array. And then the final thing we need to do is come back up and let's just grab this new event that we created up above, and we're going to dispatch the event again. So if I clear this out, save it, come over here, you'll notice it's gone and grabbed that, and then it's thrown a new event. It dispatched a new event. Now our event handler here on the recipe container has saying, hey, whenever I see that this event has been triggered, I need to both display the recipes to the UI and mirror that state to the local storage. So it basically reinforces itself, adding it back to the local storage to make sure it's there. All right, great. Now we've got a couple other things we need to worry about. The first of which is how to delete these recipes. So if I refresh here, it's just staying there. If I click delete, nothing happens. All right, so how do we account for these delete recipe buttons? It might be tempting to write a function that would, or an event handler for this button itself. But the problem is the button doesn't actually show, it's not actually part of the page until after you add it. So we need to look for something that's not that button, but where we can use whatever the click is to determine whether or not we're clicking on the button. So we can use the parent that is already on the page, and that parent is the recipe container itself. So let's come down here and say recipe container, and we're using the parent to basically identify a click and figure out what we've clicked on. So we can say add event listener, and we're listening for a click on the parent itself. And when that happens, let's go ahead and grab the event itself and do an arrow function, and we'll just say console.log e.target. All right, and then let's come over here. I'm going to pull up my console, scroll down, and as I click, you'll see I'm clicking on the li. Now I'm clicking on this card method, li again over here. Let's see, can I click on it outside here? Yeah, I'm clicking on the column. Now I come here and I click on the button. So we can use that event delegation to say, hey, e.target, what I want to know about the target is if it dot matches, that is if it has, and this is like a query selector basically, if it has the class of dot button outline danger, which is the class we added only to those delete buttons. So if I come here again and I'm console logging false, 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 true. All right, so that tells me, hey, I've clicked on the thing I'm trying to see if I'm clicking on. We can use that event delegation then to say not console log, but if. So if that is the case, if we've actually clicked on that, then we want to run a function. We're going to say delete item, let's see, a recipe from list. And then we're going to pass it the e.target.value. You might remember that when we added the delete buttons here, we added a value, and we can reference the ID by doing e.target.value. Now I'll wrap this here, and then let's go ahead and run or write this delete recipes from list function. So I'll come up here and say function delete recipes. It's going to take in that ID that we've been passed. And the first thing we're going to do is say let's just console log ID. So if we come in here and let's see, unexpected token 75. What did we mess up? Okay, perfect. So I come in here, and now if I hit delete, it should pass us this. Now this ID here is actually not a number, it's passing us a string, but we're going to try to use that to cross the number that we've passed in. Let's see right here, the date.now, that's an actual number. So how do we get a number and not a string? And the easiest way to do that is probably just to wrap this in a capitalized number, and that will then pass us a number. When I come back in here and I click, you'll notice now this is blue telling me it's a number and not a string. So this is the final thing we need to do, and what we're going to do is we're going to take our list items, we're going to say that that's now equal to list items.filter. So this is another array method, and what we're going to do is say we want to look for the item that has the item in our array that has the item.id that does not match the ID. So we want all items that don't match the ID we've passed in, which means we want everything but the deleted item, and that's our new array of list items. So we're removing that one that we clicked on. Once we do that, it's as easy as taking this new custom event and dispatching it one more time. So if I come in here and I click, now it will actually dispatch that and remove it, and then trigger this same event. So it will display the recipes again and update our local storage. So by writing this custom event, we can actually trigger it whenever we want, and it reduces the amount of code we need to write. And now in 78 lines of code, we've written this whole kind of cool functionality. Because we added that little ternary here, it says, hey, there's no length, so I'm just not going to include that list item at all. So we refresh, everything stays just as you'd expect, and we can come in here and delete this one, and it refreshes everything just as we'd expect. Come in here, close that out, perfect. That looks like a completed project to me. Hopefully that was fun, and writing your own custom events and stuff like that kind of gave you some new ways to think about how to refresh a UI, how to update local storage. Again, all the code will be in a repo that I'll post down below. I'll also try to have this up live somewhere if you want to look at it and play around with it. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you're not already, and I will catch you next time. Happy coding.